The education of a man is never completed until he dies. Robert E. Lee. To be service is the rent that you pay for room on this earth. Shirley Chisholm. And then the last one is going to be anti-racism work is not self-improvement for white people. It doesn't end when white people feel better about what they've done. It ends when black people are staying alive and their liberation. Or they have their liberation, I apologize. Rachel Cargill, sorry. Stumbled on that one at the very end a little bit. I get a little emotional reading that one. Okay, so we're gonna have our speakers start now, if that's cool. And are you ready?
Sure.
Cool. So Anna Edwards is going first. She is the chair of the Sacred Ground Historical Reclamation Project, which was founded in 2004, and is still the leader of the crusade for the 9-acre Memorial Park and Educational Campus in Shockoe Bottom. She's the founding editor of the Virginia Defender and has been the most recent recipient of the VCU Graduate Alumni Achievement Award, just because she's excellent. So, yes.
So I am not the founding editor of the Virginia Defender newspaper. My husband is the founding editor of the Virginia Defender newspaper, and it's been going since 2005. I think I was asked to talk about the history, the Black history of Richmond, Virginia, and that's really kind of too big.
15 minutes.
So,
we appreciate you, though.
So I'm standing here because, so I am going to actually, it's funny, speaking to that Alumni Achievement Award, which was really fascinating, because I deeply appreciated them sending me an email saying, by the way, we've decided to create this new award and we've decided to select you for the first recipient. And I thought, wasn't that interesting? Because I only graduated like 15 minutes ago, and you're giving me the Alumni Achievement Award for contributions to my field. And so obviously it was a lot of retrospective stuff. And obviously that was, and yeah, obviously and cynically, that was to, the history department's wanting to boost itself, probably in the VCU world. It's humanities are struggling, history departments are struggling, and there are ways in which you take advantage of your resources to boost your status if you can. So I'm like, okay, I get that. But what's interesting about it is that I was an odd story anyway. So not yes and no, right? Okay, so there have been plenty of older students who go back to school and get a degree, and I was an artist or an art student originally when I was in school, and then I changed to history. And the reason I changed to history was because of Virginia, was because of my parents or my grandmother in particular telling me that I was descendant from a woman who had been sold out of Richmond back probably in the 1840s out of Richmond, that there was this story of a girl who was probably pregnant, who was on the boat and could see her mother on the dock receding into the misty distance. This is very poetic, right? Very evocative imagery. And but nobody knew exactly who she was. They weren't quite sure. I come to Virginia after, like I said, I'm a huge reader. I read Gone with the Wind, and as a little girl, it was an engrossing book. I can't actually ever recall going, "Ooh, I love this book," right? And I saw the movie, and the movie, was fun because it was a movie and it was Technicolor. Always cringy, when the Black people came on screen because of what they were asked to do. And even as a child, I knew that they had been told this is how they had to portray these characters. I read a book called House Divided, and I have to say that was probably the most influential in terms of, it was probably the most education I got about the Civil War, and in Virginia in particular, because this book was written, as it turns out, by a nephew of Longstreet, General Longstreet. I think his name was Ben Ames something. Nobody else has read this book. 1,400 pages of epic Virginia story, memory making and storytelling. And it was about it was about an aristocratic Southern plantation family which was beginning to see hard times as the Civil War creeps up, but has had this terrible, or sort of, discomforting story in its family history that their patriarch was actually related to Abraham Lincoln, that they shared Lincoln's mother was somehow related to both of these people. And these are the two different trajectories that they went off on. Could easily be Jeff Davis's story, I guess, in some ways. And so here's, and so you're centered on a woman who's like the older sister of this, and she is, so they're portrayed, she in particular is portrayed as that Southern matriarch who is going to protect and look after her world, but she also doesn't necessarily see the world in sort of the abject racist terms that we associate with it, right? She's sort of that observant, wise woman who sees the times are changing and all that jazz. And ultimately, somehow, and I don't remember the storyline anymore, actually ends up in an interview with Abraham Lincoln. She goes to see him and they have a conversation. I don't even remember what it was about. But I do remember the world that it created in this book. And so when I finally moved to Virginia in 1988, I really did feel like I was walking, not so much in the city, but in the surrounding, the suburbs and in the country. I felt like I was walking through pages of every book or movie that I had ever read. Richmond and Virginia were segregated in a way that I didn't experience growing up in Los Angeles. Los Angeles was Mexican and black and white and Japanese and Chinese. That's the city that I knew. And so coming here, where the world seemed suddenly to only be black and white, was a little startling. And I think it was one of the reasons why I just didn't say very much for a long time, because it was just taking all of this in. When I started studying, or when I learned about the story of Gabriel's rebellion in relationship to Shockoe Bottom and the burial ground down there, suddenly it was like, oh, this story of Gabriel's rebellion, which takes place in 1800, gets you back to sort of an origin story. So what, help me, I'm trying to understand how Richmond is the way it is and why it matters, right? And so there's so much I have to shortcut here, but Gabriel's rebellion, when you start unpacking it, reading the various sources, standing on the ground in Shockoe, you put your feet on the place where at that moment we understood that there was this group of people who attempted to organize the largest single rebellion in the history of Virginia anyway, by enslaved people against enslavement, and recognizing that it had this role to play in Richmond's history in particular, connecting it for people to the story of fighting the contradictions and the complexities and the hypocrisies, so much hypocrisy, right, in the founding of the country. And it depends on whose booths you're standing in as to what hypocrisy you're dealing with. But I think most recently, when I think about Gabriel, who's enslaved and becomes a leader of this rebellion. He's not the only one. We use Gabriel as a stand-in for everybody that was with him trying to do this. And we can know their names. We do know their names. We have the records. We can thank a lot of historians for that, for pulling those things together. We can know their names. We can literally articulate them if we want to. But it was a story that spoke directly to the origins of the country. So, right, how do you create a nation? And how do you create a nation when you as those who have the power and the desire to do this thing, how do you do that when you know categorically that you are building contradictions into it that could lead to its destruction down the road, right? They know this. They talk about it occasionally, but mostly they punt it down for others to deal with. They also, I think, work very hard in some ways to make the sort of constitutional language, most of it, and the Bill of Rights and those documents speak ambiguous enough to leave room for the way things might go, depending, right? And of course, all of those ambiguities mean that we still fight over things that are constitutional, to this day. We just are constantly interpreting and reinterpreting. And interpretation is kind of the point, right? This group has been formed to imagine what we might imagine is going to become of Monument Avenue. But the truth is, it's part of the conversation about reimagining what's going to be happening in Richmond, period, as a city. What story is it going to tell about itself? And what role does Monument Avenue have to play in that? Does it have a role to play in that? And in Shacklebottom, starting, say, in 1695, when this was a dinky little village with a warehouse that William Byrd had permission from the Crown in which to host the goods of the farmers near and far before it was going to be sent off by ship to other ports. Through the years, when it is laid out in 1737 to become a town, to 1780 when it becomes the capital of the state, supposedly to protect it from attack, upon which it was promptly burned later that year. And then the end of the Revolution, and we're a new nation. And 1782, we have this law that gets passed that I think was patroned by Thomas Jefferson, among others, which was described as a liberalization of law in relation to manumissions. But what it was in fact a delivery of power from the state to the slaveholder. And this was a law that basically countered a law from the 1720s that said that you had to have permission as a slaveholder, or basically you had to have the state sign off on a sale or a manumission, not a sale, a manumission. If you were going to actually free a black person, you had to have the authority of the state had to be behind that. So in 1782, it's a new nation. They can do what they want. So they're like, we're going to give that power to the slaveholder. So now slaveholders can manumit people. In those immediate years after the Revolution, there's a lot of ambiguity, a lot of people who are going, all right, should we be holding people enslaved when we have just fought this war for freedom, right, for independence and all that? So you will have in this very brief period of time between, say, 1782 and we'll just say 1800, really quite a wave of manumissions, and some of them are mass manumissions. They don't all work out as planned, but there is this sense that maybe we can do something about this place that we are trying to create and acknowledge that there's this consistency that we should have, and create a different place, and maybe we can work towards equality, although most of them weren't talking about equality. They simply were talking about maybe slavery is inconsistent with what we're trying to do, so let's change that. So we have a period where there's kind of a small explosion of free black people in Virginia and in Richmond. The percentage ultimately is really not much more than 20% of the black population of the city, and same kind of percentage in relation to the state. But it's still a number of people. Maybe it goes from 300 people to 1,500 people. And in a town like Richmond in 1800, which only had 5,700 people in it, and half of those people were black, we don't really. It's these numbers help you understand that we weren't living in a this place was a lot more mixed than we imagine, than the stories have been crafted, and in particular, maybe movies, right? When movies articulate what life was like in the 1800s or the 1700s, and in Europe as well, right? It's a white world entirely. Now, how accurate is that, and how beneficial is that even for whites to be told that their world was entirely white, that there was no, people knew what it meant to live in a mixed race society. Now, here obviously we know from our experience, from the history and what we're dealing with right now, is that there was an intention. Benjamin Franklin himself wrote, there was a particular paper, and I can't remember what it's called, and I'll bet you know what it is, but he wrote these papers. It was kind of an long opinion essay, and in that he sort of mused that wouldn't it be nice if here they could create this space where the white race could shine bright in the light of the sun because the rest of the world was brown or tawny. So it was as though he was feeling embattled as a white person and that they wanted to find some place where they could create a white society. That was his set of musings, but the institution of slavery and the economics of the country drove the need for racism to become a part of the culture, and in particular white supremacy to be a part of the culture, to describe and articulate this place that we live in. And you can see it in the laws that were created, and you can also see it in the arbitrary nature and the sort of reactive nature often of these laws. One of the things that tends to be noted is that there was no fully formed race code or fully formed slavery code that managed everything about Black life from the beginning. They didn't have it like all figured out. And part of the reason I think is also very Virginia in, as we're working through zoning and development ideas, there is this mindset that you want things to be as flexible as possible because, you know, on the one hand, okay, we want to be able to be creative, fine. But on the other hand, it's also about not wanting too many rules in place that proscribe what you can do and in such a way that those with the most power and the most toys can manipulate that system most effectively to their interests. So because of that, it meant that you probably will hear from various historians who will say, and then after that rebellion, they passed a law that said no more than 3 Black people can gather in a space, or they can't go to a funeral without white supervision, or things like that. And these are things that affect, you know, mundane daily life. But it's because often they found that these laws were not enforceable on a consistent daily basis because daily life takes over, because human need takes over. And so there would be these sort of punctuation marks of policy and law that got put into place in order to remind people that society is supposed to be structured like this, and we need to remind you that you have to behave in this way, otherwise we're going to do this. And so it is to speak to the examples that were given during the course of the session about what lies we were told, but what experiences we've had, to say that it's mundane, it is arbitrary, it is it's what I described to myself when I realized what it was that Monument Avenue, why it bothered me so much while the statues were still up, which was that it was like every time I drove down that street, and I drove down it all the time for my daily life for 20 years, was that it was like every time I actually looked at a statue, I felt like I was getting another little cut. And another little cut. Well, I can get over a cut, a splinter or a prick, right? But day after day, year after year, you start to feel that there's an actual wound that is not going to heal until something is tackled, you know, head on. What we have been trying to do in Shockoe Bottom with the history of Gabriel's Rebellion is unpack the early history of Richmond so that we can begin to understand the ways in which these wounds have been affecting us. And I do think it's really important to talk about the wounds. Well, that's not what I wanted to say, actually. And some of this is going to come up over and over again. So, you know, it is the idea that we really and truly are lots of people living simultaneous lives through very different lenses and very different experiences. And we have to do this individual sharing, but we also have to make sure that this is intentionally placed in the public landscape, right? So just like saying Black Lives Matter is not an undermining of everybody else's life, to finally put some of the actual reality of the fact that there was Black life as a part of Richmond's daily life into the physical landscape that we are going to put in as we are fighting to get it done, And future generations aren't going to know about this fight to the same degree that we are. They're just going to encounter this landscape, and they're going to bring their own stuff to this landscape. So we have a responsibility to obviously to do as good a job as we can. But I think we have this really amazing moment in which to try to make this landscape actually reflect who we have been and who we are, who we will be. We have to live up to those coming next, right? And I think I'll stop there, unless people have specific questions that I have not answered about Richmond history. But I think that this evolution that we go through, and it is a cyclical one, from that year when we've got the revolution about freedom and these manumissions that take place, and then the end of the transatlantic slavery, which builds the domestic market, which then also resituates the idea of white supremacy, because we've accepted that we're a slave society, and we have to have these structures in place. And then the end of the Civil War, which wipes out slavery, which means how do we structure society in order to preserve that thing that we had created, and then how the struggle of Reconstruction into Jim Crow represents a period that we are now going back and examining, because it looks so much like what we're going through right now, right? So that's critical. That's really critical to do. So I think the last thing I'll say is, maybe, I don't know if it'll be controversial in this room or not, I was not thrilled to find out that the state gave $11 million to the reimagining of Monument Avenue. It wasn't. I don't think it should have it. I don't. It's a street that has to be rethunk because of how it was founded and because of what it has meant. I don't think it should now be sort of, let's figure out a new way to re-glorify Monument Avenue and put those kind of resources to it when we have such need in other directions. And I even fight, or not fight so much as say, when we created the Memorial Park proposal, and somebody tell me the 13-minute mark, how much past it I am.
Don't worry about it.
Okay.
You just go.
So when the Memorial Park proposal was designed to help us rethink the way we prioritize development, and specifically to preserve a particular piece of landscape that had the capability to tell a particular story because it's primary source soil in many ways. But we never said within 10 years we need to see on this place. We weren't trying to predetermine exactly how that interpretation takes place. And so we offered this as a concept for a phased development. And because we know the money's not there, and because we know that the money that's needed is needed for many other things. And that's a logical trajectory in a particular way, which I think you can follow. So the last thing that I will say, I promise, is that we should think about what we do to leave a legacy of actually understanding what this moment means. Is it physical objects in the landscape, or is it to change something institutional or systemic to address an actual problem? I really wanted that to be in the mix of the thinking of this group, because you have a lot to think about. And then I also want you to think about being an ally in the other struggles that are going on that involve landscape and the right of oppressed peoples to self-determination in the face of an oppressor. Okay.